righty here. So continuing with Tillich, the intertestamental period, beginning page 9 on to 10. He talks about something we talked about in class, the time that we call the intertestamental period, a movement toward the idea of radical transcendence of God. Middle of page 10, this made it possible for the Greek philosophers who had introduced the same radical abstraction with respect to God, in moving away from Greek mythology toward a much more sort of, we'll say, abstract and theoretical notion of God, and the Jewish universalists to unite on the idea of God. It was Philo of Alexandria, we mentioned him, a precise contemporary of Jesus over in Alexandria, Egypt, who carried through this union. And then once you sort of develop a strong notion of transcendence or otherness of God, distance, if you will, then the felt religious need is for some way to bridge the gap or to draw near to God. And this is often where what are sometimes called bridge terms become useful, like wisdom or spirit or the hand of God or the arm of God, angels, various ways in which we kind of frame the ways in which we can still speak of God being near to us or working with us. Yeah, I'm going to keep moving. I think we've talked about it in class quite a bit already. But good stuff. It's certainly worth your thinking about. I'll say on page 12, bottom paragraph, about 5 lines down, Tillich talks about the synagogue becoming the form in which the decisive religious life develops, again, during this time, several centuries before Jesus. And, of course, we read often of synagogues in the Gospels as sort of little centers, local centers of Jewish life, piety, community, identity, all those good things. The law was not evaluated in the negative way in which we usually do it, that is, by Jews. And when he says we usually, he means we Christians, and I would say especially Protestants, and maybe especially Lutheran Protestants. For the Jews, the law was a gift and a joy. The law was eternal, always in God, and pre-existent in the same way. So this is quite true, that the Torah becomes understood as God's pre-existing word or law. In the same way that later Christian theology said that Jesus was pre-existent. And I think that was a slip of the theological tongue on Tillich's point, because typically he wouldn't have used the term Jesus there. We talked about this in class a little bit. None of the early Christians would have, for sure. They seem to have a more careful notion than we do today about the fact that the term Jesus refers precisely to the human being who began to exist at a certain time, conceived in his mother's womb. It wasn't like there was a human being named Jesus already, or even a being named Jesus, like in the heavens. And that's when he says that Jesus was pre-existent. That's really not what he wanted to say. We talk again about the pre-existent Logos, pre-existent Son. You can talk about the second person of the Trinity. But the term Jesus is most wisely restricted in its use to being the name of the human being who was, strictly speaking, the result of the incarnation of the Word, of the divine Logos. When the Word became flesh and lived among us, what we got was Jesus of Nazareth. So I probably said that enough on that already. He does some nice stuff on mystery religions, which we did not talk about in class in our time together, much if at all. In the interest of time, I probably won't do too much now. Bottom of 15, finally, the concept logos was adequate insofar as it expressed the universal self-manifestation of God in all forms of reality. Remember, logos as word, communication, divine communication. One of the things that Tillich is trying to say is the more that we understand, appreciate, utilize the notion of logos, the more we'll be open to thinking about the ways in which divine expression, communication happened, both prior to, concurrent with, and since the incarnation of the divine logos as Jesus of Nazareth. Principle of creation. Yet, he goes on to say, it is inadequate because the logos is a universal principle, whereas Jesus is a concrete reality. Yes, I don't know if that means it's inadequate. It does mean that we, as Tillich himself will say in other places, we've seen that Christianity is based on this paradox that we believe in a universal logos, presence, mind, reason, word of God, apart from which there would be no creation. That on the one hand, and our conviction that logos, in ways that really, let's face it, transcend our capacity to understand or to imagine, that logos became focused, became flesh, became a real human being in and among us as this concrete reality, that, as Tillich puts it. His is a concrete personal life described by this term, logos. This is expressed in the great paradox of Christianity. The logos became flesh. I think I'm going to develop a discussion question out of this, whether you tackle that question before, after, or apart from this video. We at some point need to talk about or think about the relationship between this ultimate word that God has spoken, that's the way that Hebrews puts it at the beginning, or in John chapter 1, that the word became flesh, and place that alongside our understanding of the Bible as divine revelation, or even as the Word of God. I'm going to save that mostly for discussion, but I just kind of want to raise that little point there. I'm going to keep moving on. Most of these I'll kind of keep to about 12 minutes. So I'm moving into chapter 2, theological developments in the ancient church. Tillich just has some really, I think, some good things to say here. On page 18, bottom paragraph, we have the, as he says, the New Testament had not been set yet. I mentioned in class, very fluid situation in terms of writings and what writings were available to any given Christian congregation, any given place. Bottom paragraph, second line, in First Clement, this is a document from the late 1st century, a complex of dogmatic and ethical doctrines quickly became traditional, and Clement calls them the canon of our tradition. This tradition had various names like truth, gospel, doctrine, and commandments. He says that the center of it was Christology, not surprising. But you'll see that later on page 39, he gives another name for this. And I think it's a very important one, and that is the rule of faith. We find, I just drank a blueberry drink and I feel like my teeth are kind of blue. Oh well. The rule of faith, very closely related, we think, to what we now call the Apostles' Creed, but kind of a collection of convictions that early Christians all kind of shared, even if it wasn't quite yet written down in any official way. So we have the rule of faith. He talks then, I think, nicely about the question of authority and who gets to be the interpreter of even such things as the rule of faith, because of course a rule of faith doesn't stand alone. Let's say we're talking about the Apostles' Creed or something like the Apostles' Creed. We actually have something that looks like a rule of faith in 1 Corinthians 15. If you want to take a look at that sometime soon. In terms of your anthology, by the way, with this reading here, be sure to read the Didache, or the excerpts from the Didache that are in your anthology. This is an early 2nd century document. Often has a pretty strongly Jewish ring to it, but definitely some early Christian instruction on things like baptism and how long you should allow a wandering prophet to stay, like, living off your church. At what point should they not be welcome any longer? Fun stuff. But the issue of authority becomes kind of critical, because you can have all the authoritative sources you want, but they still have to be read and interpreted and applied to new situations, and that's where often differences arise. And so, do we have some authority to which we appeal as the ultimate authority? And as Tillich mentions, when you read Ignatius of Antioch, you'll find Ignatius, who was a bishop of the churches in the Antioch area, he was quite insistent that you need a bishop present, to really have church. You need to have somebody there who knows the tradition, interprets it faithfully, and is sort of like, and if you go like, well, how do we know what faithfully means? It's sort of like what the bishop tells you it means. And Tillich is right to say we have the beginnings of Roman Catholicism very early, very early. I mean, at the latest, early 2nd century, what we now call Roman Catholicism is definitely taking shape in terms of a structure of authority, hierarchy of authority and power. We could say, like it or not, that's the fact. All right, I'm going to pause this one.